To welcome you today to today's meeting, which is another in the Center's ongoing series on terrorism and homeland security that we co-sponsor with the Georgetown University's Center for Peace and Security Studies, directed by Professor Bruce Hoffman, who's the co-chair of this series. So welcome you to today's event. Let me now turn the floor over to Bruce Hoffman, who will introduce today's speaker and also say a word or two about the topic that we're addressing today, which is the new Muslim Brotherhood in the West, new book by Lorenzo Vidino. And I just would add, for those who are attending today's session, we have copies for purchase just adjacent to this room. So thank you and welcome. Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rob. Welcome. Before I introduce Lorenzo, let me say we're probably going to have to end a bit early today rather than going till 1:30 as we normally do. We'll break at 1:15, and we're actually starting about 5 or 10 minutes earlier than we usually do. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Lorenzo Vidino here, actually for the second time. He came and spoke to us 2 years ago as well. As Rob just described, he's the author of the recently published book, The New Muslim Brotherhood in the West, that's published in actually the series that I edited at Columbia University Press. And as Rob said, there's copies outside that are available for purchase, and I'm sure Lorenzo would be delighted to inscribe them to you. This is Lorenzo's second book. He's also the author of Jihad in Europe. He's a graduate of the University of Milan, where he earned his law degree. He then undertook his PhD studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and he's currently a visiting fellow at the RAND Corporation. He was previously a visiting fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard University and has held various other appointments. Lorenzo, thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Bruce. It's a real pleasure to be back here, and I think it shows the foresight of the center in having a talk on the Muslim Brotherhood. And to be fair, this was something that was decided well before that the Muslim Brotherhood became very cool subject to talk about. So kudos to the insight, the foresight of Robert and Bruce. We've all heard a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood over the last couple of months. And I think the one thing we can all agree is that how divided the opinions are, whether in Washington or in Europe, about the Muslim Brotherhood. I have to say this split in opinions is very much matched by the split that I see in my research that I've done over the last 10 years, give or take, on the Muslim Brotherhood in the West. Actually, I would say that the divide that I see when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood in the West is even more acute, because if the debate over the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East revolves around the group's aims or how to engage or whether to engage the Muslim Brotherhood, when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood in the West, the debate starts at an even earlier point. Does the Muslim Brotherhood exist in the West? My answer to that is obviously yes, otherwise we wouldn't be having a book talk, otherwise the book wouldn't exist. But it's a qualified yes, a yes that needs to be explained, and the best way to do so is through a brief historical overview. The roots of what I call the Muslim Brotherhood in the West go back to the 1960s and 1970s, mostly to Egypt, when the Nasser regime started cracking down brutally on the Muslim Brotherhood, incarcerating, torturing, and executing several of its members. Those events triggered three developments within the Muslim Brotherhood. A first wing, led, at least ideologically, by Said Qutb, decided to opt for violent confrontation with the regime. In a way, that is why we can see the Muslim Brotherhood, and of course that's an oversimplification, as kind of the forefathers of groups that embrace violence. So whether it's Jamaat Islamiyya, and then an Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and then later on Al-Qaeda. The second wing of the Brotherhood, which was the main wing of the Brotherhood, decided for accommodation, decided to Islamize Egyptian society for an Islamization bottom-up, find a modus vivendi with the Egyptian regime, participate in elections, act at the grassroots, but refuse, mostly for tactical reasons, a violent confrontation. That is the main part of the Brotherhood and what we see as today the Brotherhood in Egypt. But a third wing within the Brotherhood decided to simply leave the country and migrate. Many of his militants went to the Arab Gulf. Saudi Arabia in particular, but also to other countries, and really spearheaded many of the global Muslim organizations that we see, like the Muslim World League, World Assembly of Muslim Youth, and so forth. A smaller number went to the West, whether Europe or North America. So by the 1960s, we saw a handful, we're really talking about small numbers of activists, people like Saeed Ramadan, Tariq Ramadan's father, for example, and a larger, but still quite small, number of younger militants who came to study in Europe's and America's universities. The combination of experienced militants and enthusiastic students bore immediate fruits, and Brotherhood activists founded some of the first Muslim organizations in the West. It is very important to point out, I think, as I'm trying to, and I think I made clear, that the arrival of the Brotherhood in Europe and North America was not the first phase of a sort of an arcane and concerted plot to Islamize the West. It was really the fruit of fortuitous events that took place in the 60s and the 70s. Yet the small organizations that formed spontaneously at that time soon developed beyond the most optimistic expectations of their founders. The West freedoms allowed the brothers to openly conduct the activities for which they were persecuted in their home countries. So with little funds, but plenty of enthusiasm, they published magazines, created organizations, organized lectures, carried out all sorts of activities through which they could spread their ideology. Their activism soon attracted other students and other immigrants from the Muslim population, the growing Muslim population of Europe and North America. Today, the small student organizations created some 30, 40 years ago have grown exponentially, becoming some of the most visible and active Muslim organizations in virtually all Western countries. So this is sort of what I mean by Muslim Brotherhood in the West. In essence, there is no formal Muslim Brotherhood organization in any Western country. Yet it is fair to say that in virtually all Western countries operate organizations and networks with historical, financial, personal, organizational, and ideological, I think ideological is the most important part, ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic revivalist movements worldwide, such as Milli Görüş for the Turkish population or Jamaat Islami for the South Asian population. It is essentially a fairly small, informal network of activists tied together by personal, financial, organizational, and ideological ties. Each organization belonging to the movement acts independently, adapting its actions to the environment in which it operates. But a foundation of commonly accepted goals and principles unites them. I generally refer to these Brotherhood legacy groups as New Western Brotherhood, hence the title of the book. And let me explain the three words. The term brothers indicate that these networks have various connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, but does in no way indicate that the organizations operating in the West are linked by a dependent relationship to the Egyptian or any other branch of the Brotherhood in the Middle East. New indicates that this network subscribes to the gradualist, accommodationist line adopted by the Egyptian Brotherhood in the 70s, so rejection of violence and participation in the political system. And finally, Western encapsulates the geographic peculiarity of these organizations, while drawing significantly from the intellectual heritage of Hassan al-Banna and the Brotherhood in general. These organizations in the West have adapted their goals and modus operandi to their particular environment. So I think it's fair that today, thanks to a combination of ideological flexibility, unrelenting activism, access to very large funding, and poor organizations of competing trends, the networks originally established by the Brotherhood pioneers have grown exponentially. Even if their membership has remained fairly small, the Western Brothers have shown an enormous ability to monopolize the Islamic discourse, making their interpretation of Islam not mainstream, but at least the most readily available. Moreover, in many countries, the Western Brothers have positioned themselves at the forefront of the competition to be the main interlocutors of Western establishments, whether it's governments or media. Although circumstances vary from country to country significantly, it is fair to say that no other Islamic movement has the visibility, political influence, and access to Western elites that the Western Brothers have obtained over the last 15, 20 years. Now, what are the aims of this network that I described? It is, of course, quite difficult and controversial to assess. There's no agreement there. First of all, because as any large movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, whether in the West or globally, is hardly a monolithic bloc. Personal or ideological divisions are common. There are divergences on how the movement should achieve its goals, and actually in some cases even on what those goals should be. Nevertheless, I think it's possible to identify some common goals for all these organizations in the West. Foremost among them, I would argue, is the preservation of a strong Islamic identity among Western Muslims. As any religiously conservative movement, they are concerned with maintaining the morality and piety of their communities. Yet, unlike Salafists or other Islamic trends that seek to strengthen the Islamic identity of Western Muslims, the Brothers do not advocate isolation from society. To the contrary, they urge Muslims to actively participate in society, but only insofar as such engagement is necessary to change it in an Islamic fashion. Very interesting to elaborate on this point and see the writings of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, which is arguably the ideological godfather of the Brotherhood, both in the West and globally. And Qaradawi argues that Muslims in the West should adopt what he calls a conservatism without isolation, an openness without melting. So finding the balance, of course, between this cultural impermeability on one hand and active socio-political interaction is not easy. But the Brothers, in a way, see themselves as those capable of defining how Muslims can be loyal to their faith, yet at the same time active citizens of Western secular democracies. These guiding roles that the Brothers see from themselves is, according to them, sort of an unprecedented opportunity for the movement. And again, I'm quoting Qaradawi, in playing the role of the missing leadership of the Muslim nation with all its trends and groups. So what is Qaradawi saying? While in Muslim-majority countries the Brotherhood can exercise only limited influence, as it is kept in check by local regimes, but they oppose their activities, Qaradawi realizes that no such obstacles prevent it from operating in the free and democratic West. Moreover, Muslim immigrants and their children, in a way disoriented by the impact of life in non-Islamic societies and often lacking the most basic knowledge of Islam, represent an ideally receptive audience for the movement's message. Finally, as I said, no competing Islamic trend has the financial means and organization to compete with the Western Brothers. So this combination of factors leads Qaradawi and the Brothers in general to conclude that the West is sort of a tabula rasa from a religious point of view, a virgin territory where the Brothers can implement their dawah, their preaching freely, overcoming their competition with their superior mobilization skills and funds. Now, if this is probably the first goal, the second goal, what I would argue that this organization have, is being designated as official or de facto representatives of Muslim communities in their countries. Despite this unrelenting activism and ample resources that I mentioned, the Brothers have not been able to create a mass movement in any Western country. And they've not been able to attract a large allegiance from within the Muslim communities. But they do understand that a preferential relationship with Western elites could provide them with the financial and political capital that would allow them to significantly expand their reach and influence inside the community. By leveraging such relationship with governments and establishments in general, the Brothers aim at being entrusted by Western governments with administering all aspects in a way of Muslim life in each country. This is probably a discourse that is more fitting about Europe rather than the United States. But what they are seeking in a way is to become those whom government would entrust with appointing imams in public institutions, in teaching Islam in the public school system, for example, that's the case in places like Holland or Germany, running the Islamic hour on public television and so forth. So in a way, they're making a clever political calculation. They're seeking to be recognized as representatives of the Muslim community in order to actually become it. Finally, I think this position of representatives of Western Muslim communities would allow the brothers to influence Western policymaking on all Islamic-related issues, whether it's domestic policies or foreign policy. So these are sort of the goals that they are, in a way, trying to achieve. I have tried to describe so far the brothers, the Western brothers, as rational actors operating within the democratic framework to achieve their political goals, and as main candidates, thanks to their resources and activism, for the role of representatives of Western Muslim communities. Now, the second part of my book looks at Western policymaking. How do Western governments see these networks and these organizations? How do they interact with them? That is probably describing this dynamic is probably even more challenging than describing the first part, because the policymaking in virtually all Western countries on the issue can only be described as schizophrenic. I think we have two sort of extremes of the debate, which I would call the optimists and the pessimists. And the optimists argue that the new Western brothers are a socially conservative force that, unlike many of the other movements with which they are often mistakenly lumped with, encourage the integration of Western Muslim communities. Moreover, argue the optimists, Western brothers provide young Muslims with a positive affirmation, urging them to convey their energy and frustration into the political process rather than into violence and extremism. Governments should harness the new Western brothers' grassroots activities and cooperate with them on issues such as unemployment, crime, drugs, or radicalization. Now, the pessimist, opposite side of the spectrum, see a much more sinister nature in the new Western Brotherhood. Thanks to the resources and naivete of most Westerners, they argue that the new Western Brothers are a Trojan horse engaged in a slow but steady social engineering program aimed at Islamizing Western Muslim populations and ultimately competing with Western governments for their allegiance. Pessimists point at sort of a discrepancy between the internal and the external discourse of Brotherhood organizations, and simply argue that the brothers have understood that infiltrating the system rather than attacking it head-on is the best way to obtain what they want. The approach that Al-Qaeda uses, that the jihadists uses, takes them nowhere. The brothers understand that, and if the goals are the same, argue the pessimists, the tactics differ. The brothers have understood that the most fruitful approach is cozying up to Western elites and gain their trust. Now, I put in the pessimist category most intelligence agencies in continental Europe, and I think that's an interesting point to raise. And I want to read you a couple of quotes that come, one from German intelligence and one from Dutch intelligence. This is what the Germans say. This is public information, their annual report, and says, these legalistic Islamist groups represent an especial threat to the internal cohesion of our society. Among other things, their wide range of Islamist-oriented educational and support activities, especially for children and adolescents from immigrant families, are used to promote the creation and proliferation of an Islamist milieu in Germany. These endeavors run counter to the efforts undertaken by the federal administration and the states to integrate immigrants. There is the risk that such milieus could also form the breeding ground for further radicalization. This is Bundesverfassungsschutz in Germany. The AFD in the Netherlands, again, positions itself as a very pessimist when it comes to the Brotherhood in the West, and says in its annual, in a public report, not all Muslim brothers or their sympathizers are recognizable as such. They do not always reveal their religious loyalties and ultra-Orthodox agenda to outsiders. Apparently cooperative and moderate in their attitudes to Western society, they certainly have no violent intent. But they are trying to pave the way for ultra-Orthodox Islam to play a greater role in the Western world by exercising religious influence over Muslim immigrant communities and by forging good relations with relevant opinion leaders, politicians, civil servants, mainstream social organizations, non-Islamic clerics, academics, journalists, and so on. This policy of engagement has been more noticeable in recent years and might possibly herald a certain liberalization of the movement's ideas. It presents itself as a widely supported advocate and legitimate representative of the Islamic community. But the ultimate aim, argue the Dutch, although never stated openly, is to create, then implant and expand an ultra-Orthodox Muslim bloc inside Western Europe. Very much on the pessimist side. So there is kind of a consensus when it comes to continental European intelligence agencies being quite pessimist. I think there's a split when it comes to the Anglo-Saxon world, not taking a position for a variety of reasons we can talk about later. Nevertheless, despite these positions that come from the intelligence agencies, governments, lawmakers, bureaucrats of all levels in all countries are not bound by the assessments of their intelligence agencies and often espouse very different opinions. Experts from within and outside government often influence policymakers' opinion, leading to a very complex and I would argue often chaotic situation in which institutions swing erratically from the optimist to the pessimist point of view and everything in between. There's no, in any Western country, there's no centrally issued white paper or set of internal guidelines, if you will, sent to all government agencies detailing how Western Brotherhood organizations should be identified, assessed, and eventually engaged. This leads to enormous inconsistencies in policies, not only from one country to the other, but also within each country. Within each ministry and within each office of each ministry. It's really goes down to the personalities that take certain decisions. And I think the difficulties that most Western governments have experienced in assessing and engaging Western Brotherhood organizations are paradigmatic of the challenges posed by such a complex movement. Conceptualizing a movement that mixes politics and religion, particularly a religion about which most policymakers, to be honest, know little, has proven extremely difficult. In some cases, the Brothers' actions and rhetoric seem to reflect the moderation and pro-integration stance that Western governments are desperately looking for in their interlocutors within Muslim communities. In others, they seem to harbor an agenda and embrace values completely opposed to those of a Western liberal democracy. Policymakers eager to find solutions to urgent problems involving the Muslim community find themselves in a bind. So what to do next? What is the step forward? How to interact with these organizations? Many among the pessimists call for policies that would exclude Western Brotherhood organization from any engagement. I think those voices do have a point in highlighting some troubling aspects of the Western Brothers' nature and agenda that unquestionably need to be addressed. But this position is unrealistic and arguably dangerous. Although their claims of representativeness are often overblown, the new Western Brotherhood organizations do represent a significant cross-section of the Muslim community. Talking only to those Muslim leaders whose positions square with the governments and pretending that more confrontational voices do not exist is hardly a constructive policy. Moreover, and more pragmatically, marginalization could trigger a dangerous radicalization of the movement. Again, the opposite approach taken by the optimists is to see the new Western Brothers as reliable partners. I think this approach is also problematic. Assigning an almost monopolistic control of the community to a handful of self-appointed leaders whose aims are at best unclear seems naive, to say the least. But I think over the last few years, we've seen that many Western policymakers consider a third option, which entails a cautious engagement of Western Brotherhood organizations. First of all, most governments are increasingly trying to engage as many voices as possible within Muslim communities, not just the most vocal and visible. New Western Brotherhood organizations, as I said, do represent a section of the community, but their activism and visibility should not be mistaken for universal representativeness, as it has happened in some cases in the past, and I think Great Britain is a good example of that. Second, there's a growing awareness of the need of a more refined approach. There are indeed significant advantages in not isolating new Western Brotherhood organizations, for example, in the security field and when it comes to radicalization. But engagement, which is a very vague term, needs to be based on a firm understanding of the history, characteristics, modus operandi, and most importantly, aims of the Western Brotherhood. Finally, many policymakers increasingly understand the difference between engagement and empowerment. Establishing a permanent dialogue and even occasional and limited forms of partnership with new Western Brotherhood organizations can produce several positive outcomes. But entrusting them with undue powers that would give them the keys to the Muslim community appears to be an option that most Western governments are no longer willing to choose. So I think this is kind of where we're headed, where we're seeing kind of a more middle-of-the-road approach. What would influence, and I'm about to wrap up here, is the evolution that these organizations will also take. The biggest mistake is to look at this organization as not only as monolithic, but also as static. To the contrary, they're quite dynamic. And what we are witnessing, especially right now, is that these organizations that were established some 40 years ago by what I call the pioneers are undergoing a significant change. First of all, internally, demographically, as the old leadership is slowly being passed to a new generation of Western-born activists who will inevitably add their perspectives and their points of views. Some would argue that, and call these organizations now as post-Islamist, even though the real meaning of this expression, I think, still has to be defined. Some, like Olivier Roy, for example, argue that the Western Brothers will become, I'm quoting, a Muslim church in Europe, which will pose little or no security threat, but will push for conservative moral and social values. Others would argue that the more pro-democracy and pro-integration statements of the new generation are just a carefully devised smokescreen for the movement's real aims. I think this is, of course, a never-ending debate, but we have to take into consideration the fact that these organizations are evolving. Only time will tell exactly how they will evolve. And it is not unlikely that different wings of the movement will go in separate and opposing directions. I think for the time being, given this sort of uncertainty, a policy of cautious and informed engagement appears to be the most appropriate. And I think that's where most governments, in Europe in particular, are leaning. I'll wrap it up here.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Let me open up the discussion by asking you actually two questions. One is there's been criticism of the Muslim Brotherhood, much like Hamas's covenant has a fairly uncompromising stance, that similarly the Brotherhood's charter calls for holy war and uses rhetoric that perhaps does not suggest the moderation that the optimists find. So I wonder if you could assess that. And then secondly, perhaps more positively, can the Muslim Brotherhood be the bridge that I think Western societies have been searching for in reaching more hardcore jihadis, for example, in helping as part of counter-radicalization efforts to damp down the more violent inclinations of that extreme as well?
Yeah. To the first point, I mean, you're absolutely right. I'm trying to distinguish in a way the Brotherhood in the West and in the Middle East. And I think there's a growing gap between the two, although I am very much aware that we don't know everything. We don't know all the internal dynamics. It would be extremely naive and arrogant of me to come here and say that we know exactly how these dynamics within the Brotherhood in every country and within with the different branches of the Brotherhood work. We don't know. That's the bottom line. I think when it comes to especially the Brotherhood in Egypt, in the Middle East, there's no question that if you look at the charter of Hamas, if you still look at what the Quran Murshid of the Brotherhood openly says still now, it's very much an non-democratic, non-respectful of human rights, and quite violent message. There's no question about it. There's a divide within the Brotherhood, I think, between what is the old generation, the old guard, to which the Murshid belongs to, and some of the younger activists, the second generation of the 50-year-old, and the third generation of the bloggers, the Facebook crowd that everybody talks about, who do take a different approach and challenge the old leadership on a variety of issues. Now, portraying also this, assuming that the posture taken by this younger generation is genuine and not just a smokescreen for us naive Westerners, assuming that. And I'm willing to grant that. We're still not exactly embracing democracy and human rights the way we would see them in the West. But it's very much problematic to see where the Brotherhood stand. If we've seen one thing in Egypt over the last month or so, we can't get a straight answer out of the Brotherhood on everything, whether it's the treaty with Israel, whether it's the treatment of minorities or women. You get 4 people and you get 5 different opinions. Whether that is double talk or fissures within the group, I don't know the answer to that. To your second question, which is a very, very controversial issue, particularly in Europe, is the idea of whether non-violent Islamists, so Brotherhood organizations, can be used against the violent ones. So if Europeans are invested significant human, financial, and political capital in these counter-radicalization policies, and they're looking for partners within their Muslim communities, who is best positioned to counter violent radicalization, counter the appeal of the jihadists? And there's 2 arguments there. There's those that argue that the Brotherhood is non-violent Islamists in general, and the Brotherhood in particular, are best positioned, best suited to do that job, to act sort of as a firewall. If we see radicalization as kind of a continuum, non-violent Islamists can stop the radicalization process halfway through. They act sort of as a firewall, because only they possess the sort of the street credibility, the legitimacy to influence young people who are fascinated by Al-Qaeda's ideology. Whether we like it or not, they're not going to listen to what we would, and I hate the word, talking about radicals and moderates, but they're not going to listen to what we would term as a moderate. A radical will only listen to another radical. So that's one line of thinking. The other line of thinking is that actually these organizations act, rather than firewalls, they act as conveyor belt. They create a sort of a fertile environment for more radical groups to actually seize on and help further this radicalization process. They make mainstream a certain narrative, the message that Islam is under attack, that the West is at war with Islam, which is a message that the Brotherhood, like Al-Qaeda, espouses. Of course, the solution to that is different between the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, but the Brotherhood helps making this narrative mainstream, and then it makes it easier for Al-Qaeda and other groups to come in and further radicalize. So there's those that argue that it would be silly for us to partner with a group that espouses the same narrative. Moreover, even assuming that we can, in some cases, achieve something in the security field by partnering with Brotherhood organizations, the long-term implications on integration, on social cohesion, that come with partnering and empowering these organizations vastly offset the positives. You're giving legitimacy, you're giving a pulpit to organizations that, at the end of the day, have aims that are counter to those of Western governments when it comes to integration, when it comes to social cohesion. So you might achieve something. For example, they might be able to influence that one individual not to become a terrorist. Nevertheless, you're giving them a platform that has much wider implications. But it's a never-ending debate. And I think, again, the idea there is to engage without empower. So to find small tactical partnerships where you, in a very realpolitik approach, try to achieve as much as you can, because there are cases in which you make deals with the devil, and you can work also with not ideal partners, but if they help you achieve a certain goal, that's fine, but at the same time without empowering them. Of course, it's easy to say engage without empower. When you're actually trying to implement that, it's quite challenging, and that's what most European governments have really been struggling with.
Thank you. Questions, please identify yourself and your institutional affiliation. Yes, ma'am. I think we have microphones coming over.
Thank you. I'm Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. I'm finding it a little bit difficult to grapple with exactly the size, influence, et cetera, of the organizations as you describe them. And I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about the size of membership in these organizations, not only in exactly what numbers they are, but how do they differ in size of membership from other Muslim organizations in the countries that you're talking about? And can you assess the relative influence of what you call the Brotherhood organizations as opposed to other, particularly other large Muslim organizations?
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a million-dollar question. I think everybody's sort of struggling with that. Okay, the situation is sort of different from country to country. Giving kind of a general answer, when it comes to active membership of these organizations is, as I said, very, very small. Depending on what country we're talking about, for the large countries would be maybe a couple of thousand people, something along those lines. What is disproportionately large is the visibility, for example, the ability to organize mass events, but mobilize, in some cases, hundreds and thousands of people. I'll give you an example. In most European countries, there's one annual event for the Muslim community that attracts tens of thousands of people. For example, there's the Islam Expo in the UK. There's the annual meeting of French Muslims in Le Bourget outside of Paris. Those are events that are organized by what I call Brotherhood organizations, because only they possess the funds, the ability to rent a large conference center for a week and have that kind of resources to do so. Of course, when you ask them about, how many people, belong to your organizations, they'll tell you, well, we had 100,000 people coming to our conference last week, which is a fair point, but I would argue, and of course that's very difficult to say, that the vast majority of people who attend those events are there because that's the only Muslim space, in a way, they can attend. Do they have an ideological proximity to these organizations? The vast majority of people no whatsoever. They go there because there's the only place where they can meet other Muslims, they can eat food from North Africa or South Asia and so forth. Nevertheless, some people who go there will just ignore kind of the rhetoric that comes from the lectures and the books that are being sold at those events. Some will absorb it. There's a similar argument for mosques. Despite having a very small number when it comes to leadership, they do control a large number of mosques, and in many cases these are really the large mosques in every big city. So a lot of people go to these mosques. I would argue that a lot of people that go to these large mosques don't even know that the leadership that controls these mosques is part of this informal Muslim Brotherhood network. Nevertheless, they run these big places. They do organize all these activities. It just, people go there because they are so vocal and visible. That is the dynamic. It's really the gap in resources with other organizations. Sometimes I describe this as kind of the success of a very visible minority over very unorganized other minority organizations for the control of a very silent majority. Because you have other very small organizations, all of them with just a few thousand members, but they cannot compete with Brotherhood organizations when it comes to resources. So in this state of enormous fragmentation that exists in all Western Muslim communities, huge fragmentation along ethnic, sectarian, linguistic, and political lines, where no organization in any Western country can claim to even represent what is even remotely a majority of the Muslim population. It's up to the most visible and vocal to, in a way, capture that position de facto. And that's kind of the dynamic that has happened for a while, but the numbers are small.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, and thank you for excellent presentation. Could you give us some more details?
Can you please identify yourself?
Sorry, I'm Rafi Danziger with APAC. And Could you give us some more information about the organizations that are active in the United States? Which other organizations? How large are they? Connection with the government, etc.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think historically, and there's a lot of information out on that. I kind of trace the development, but it's similar in all Western countries. The organization started as a student organization in the 1960s and 70s, and in the United States, there was the Muslim Student Association, which was created in the Midwest in the 1960s. Then it evolved into ISNA, Islamic Society of North America, which then created a variety of spin-offs. I think ISNA went in sort of a different direction. I think it would be unfair to describe ISNA of today as Brotherhood controlled or Brotherhood dominated in any way. I think there's still an ideological influence to some degree there. I mean, you have other organizations that in a way are more loyal to that message. Again, no organizational control. It would be silly, and I think as is done by some people here, to argue that these are Brotherhood organizations, meaning there's a kind of a Muslim Comintern with Cairo replacing Moscow. That is unquestionably incorrect. But when it comes to that sort of background and milieu, I think the two organizations that sort of represent kind of the Brotherhood thinking in the U.S. would be MAS and CARE, Muslim American Society, which was created in a way after the Brotherhood realized that it had lost its grip on ISNA, and hence the creation of MAS as more of a grassroots, following the Dawah approach of the Brotherhood in the early 90s. And then CARE, Council of American Islamic Relations, which of course has been quite controversial, and one just has to go to read the documents that the FBI and the Department of Justice introduced as evidence during the Holy Land Foundation trial. Those are sort of the organizations. Are they evolving? Are they changing direction? Probably. I think that's why I say there's this kind of a ISNA going in one way and CARE probably in another. But that is sort of the milieu.
Eli Lake, Washington Times. My question is, can you tell us what, if any, is the International Muslim Brotherhood? What do they do? What kind of money do they control? And what is their relationship to the Muslim Brotherhood affiliates in the West and other countries?
I don't know. Now, that would be the short answer. I think it's one of those enigmas that I think a lot of people have been struggling with. 2 or 3 years ago, most of the people I interviewed with in the Shura Council in Egypt denied the existence of an international organization. Then, a few months after that, one of its top members died, and they published the obituary on their website. The head of the international committee died. So I don't know. It's one of those things. There's a lot of rumors and speculations. With the full awareness that I probably know 10% of the actual truth, I would argue that the Egyptian Brotherhood has repeatedly tried to create kind of an international organization, mostly with the heads of Brotherhood organizations in the Arab world, not really beyond that. It never really matured into a fully functioning organization controlling everybody for 2 reasons. One is because the different regimes were keeping in check what these organizations were doing, but secondly, mostly because most organizations were kind of resistant to this control coming from Cairo. Everybody wanted to be free to operate independently. The way I see it, which again, it's probably not the full picture, is that there's coordination, unquestionably. We see it in different initiatives. There's constant coordination in activities. There's financial efforts undertaken together. There's no question about it. And there are policy lines that are drawn by the top leaders of different Brotherhood organizations in different countries. Links to the West, even more foggy, even more difficult to ascertain. There are ties that there's no question whatsoever. I would argue they're probably more informal than formal, But then again, then we saw the documents that came out of the Holy Land Foundation trial, and I think nobody would have, even in their wildest imagination, thought that such a structured organization existed, and those documents prove that. So it's, I wish I had a more precise answer to that, but the bottom line is that we don't really know.
Can I just follow up very quickly?
Sure.
Can you say anything about, because you've talked about how the Muslim Brotherhood has all these finances and financial resources, is there a kind of financial network that you would say kind of has a global reach? Or is this, can you talk about that a little bit?
No, absolutely. I mean, listen, it goes back, the roots of that go back to the 1970s, when I was saying that there was sort of this migration of members of the Brotherhood from Egypt and other countries going to the Arab Gulf. Those were the people that in the Arab Gulf filled a lot of the top positions in government, in academia, and in banking and business. And those were crucial in developing, I mean, in a way, the match made in heaven between, Saudi petrodollars and Brotherhood brain power in the 1970s is what really made, this, made a certain interpretation of Islam global. And it was Brotherhood brain power. So you have the whole Islamic banking business was in a way developed from a theoretical point of view, conceived for the most part by Brotherhood members. And these are people who sit on the Sharia board of some of the top Islamic banking institutions throughout the Arab world, with spin-offs then in the West, in Malaysia, and in other parts of the world. Qatar plays an important role there. There's a very large informal network in which the Brotherhood is very, very much tied in the Arab Gulf. And then with activities that go, that exist in all parts of the world. I think we have seen some investigations also post 9/11 here in the United States with the whole SAR network and the kind of money that was coming inside the United States and the kind of activities that they had. Institutions like Al-Taqwa, which was the first bank that was, whose assets were frozen immediately after 9/11. It's big. Nobody questions that we're talking about huge amounts of money. It's very murky, very foggy, and very difficult because of the ability of Brotherhood members to keep this very much, informal and mostly, being based in places like Liechtenstein, Bahamas, Isle of Man, Jersey, and all these places. It makes it very, very challenging to know more about it.
Judd Harriet, documentary filmmaker. The way you described the objectives and goals of the Brotherhood organizations, to me, sounds no different than any political action committee in this country. And in respect to, I believe you mentioned their goal of creating a more conservative and moral society, which is exactly what the religious right in this country wants to do. So, in consideration of these points, do you feel that the Brotherhood organizations have accepted the inevitability of operating in a pluralistic, liberal society? End of story.
We're talking about those in the West. I think for the time being, yes, absolutely. For the time being, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the two adjectives I would use to describe the Brotherhood are, flexibility and pragmatism. No question about it. I think there's no question that they fully understand that the ideas of turning the West into an Islamic society, it's something that the brothers understand that for the time being it's absolutely silly to even talk about it. Nevertheless, as some other political religious movements to which you refer, they have this view that it's the best option for humanity for everybody to be Muslim. So Qaradawi has repeatedly and publicly said, even here in the United States, that Islam will come to America, will come to Europe as a victor, as a conqueror, not through the sword, but through preaching. I think it's arguable that a lot of Christian organizations would say the same. Probably one difference there that I would see is that some of the values that Brotherhood organizations, and again, it's very difficult because we're not talking about a monolithic organization, argue are not exactly in line with democratic values when it comes to religious freedom, when it comes to men and, let's say also gay rights, men and women. On a lot of these issues, the position is hardly democratic, and I would not even make it similar to the position of some right-wing Christian groups in America. Karadawi talks about death penalty for apostasy. I don't think there's Christian groups that argue for that. I think to some degree the comparison is fair, but only to some degree.
Yes, sir.
My name is Stephen Shore. A similar question. I guess any group functioning solely within a religion is a blend, often a shifting blend, between creedalism and fellowship. Are there beliefs that are unique to the Brotherhood within Islam? And this second question may be a little bit beyond your field of study, but could one think of it as the commitment expected of members as individuals in terms of anything that goes beyond regular Muslim practices? And a question that may be slightly unfair, is it a kind of Muslim Opus Dei?
That's a new one. I'll write it down because that's interesting. I'll use that. But I think the mistake that probably I made first in my presentation is presenting this as a religious group. And that's probably, it's significantly more of a political organization rather than a religious group. There's no question about it. Just you have to, since you're talking about specifically looking at the individuals, I can't think of maybe one or two members of what I would describe as Western Brothers having a religious background, having religious training. They're all doctors or engineers, all of them. Or some businessmen. I'm a lawyer, let's be fair, also a couple of lawyers. But that's actually the accusation that comes against the Brotherhood by a lot of other Muslim organizations that are quintessentially religious, is that they're simply a political group camouflaging themselves as a religious organization. And I think that's probably a very fair point, because when it comes to religious practice, their innovation is minimum, but they're not really that interested in it. If you see the kind of product, the kind of conferences they organize, their kind of publications, it's more about politics than religion. So that's a difference. Of course, when there is, to your Opus Dei point, there's, it has, and this goes back to the teachings of Al-Banna, which wanted this 7-step kind of bottom-up Islamization, but started with recreating the Muslim individual, and had a whole very precise set of rules of how the individual should act. So there's education, tarbiyah, and being kind to other people, how to interact with your family. It really shapes how you act on a daily basis in every aspect of your life. So there is that part of teaching, but then it evolves. There's the other steps where it gets more political.
I have two questions, Lorenzo. Thank you for your excellent talk. First is, we didn't want to turn this session into, a session on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but I'd be interested in what Muslim Brotherhood, adherents in Europe have had to say about kind of events in North Africa and in the region. And secondly, kind of a recurring theme in discussions of this type, which are in the general kind of category, and I guess social scientists would call identity politics. Talk about different countries' approaches to integration strategies. And you started off with a comment from a West German, Cold War Freudian slip, a German official about threat to national cohesion. Did you to what extent is sort of the rise or relative kind of a diminished presence of Muslim Brotherhood in societies a reflection of whether the host country is pursuing a true integrationist strategy or not?
Yeah, starting with your second question. Yeah, no, I don't think that influences the presence of the Brotherhood, the different approaches to integration and to concept of citizenship, but doesn't really influence the presence of the Brotherhood. It might influence how they act, the kind of language that they use. They understand. The Brotherhood in England can say certain things about separation of church and state, but they would never say in France, of course. What changes is the approach that countries have toward the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think, I talked probably now a good time to kind of develop a bit what I was saying about, the split that I see between continental Europe and the Anglo-Saxon world. And Germany arguably takes this very, I think it's fair to characterize it as aggressive approach toward any group that can be considered as a threat to democracy. So they do monitor the Muslim Brotherhood, extremely aggressive, as they monitor many other groups. They monitor Scientology, to be honest. They monitor a lot of people that they consider potentially a threat to democracy. That is, of course, a part of their history. And the argument, a lot of people criticize them for them, saying, this is a group that acts within the democratic framework. You shouldn't do that. But, everybody who knows German history will understand why they do it. The Anglo-Saxon approach, as you can imagine, would make it very challenging and almost inconceivable, especially in the United States, to do that kind of surveillance, that kind of monitoring of these organizations. That really shapes the attitude of different countries. To your first point, how are they reacting to Egypt? Quietly, for the most part. I think they're kind of taking the approach that the Brotherhood in Egypt has taken, where you don't want to see too visible, to being at the forefront of things. When I was talking about the aims, I said one of the aims of the Brotherhood in the West is, in a way, to influence, like any other group, foreign policy decisions, whether domestic or, in this case, foreign policy, and that is by, in a way, doing their normal lobbying activity, whether it's through writing op-eds or by meeting with policymakers and trying to make a point that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is not such that evil beast that certain people make him out to be. So they are engaged in doing that as it is predictable. But at the same time, they are doing exactly what the Brotherhood in Egypt is doing. And I'm not saying by that they're in cahoots, they're talking to each other. They might be, but I don't know. But in downplaying the role that the Brotherhood might have in post-Mubarak's Egypt.
Thanks. Leah Odenek, APAC. I'm looking at what, this Egypt being the root. I wonder, has there been any effect with the Turkish model and the Turkish Brotherhood on these other movements in terms of an example or influence once in government? Could you just discuss that a little bit?
Sure. That transcends a bit the West, but absolutely. That's a big debate. Is the Brotherhood, is those Brotherhood movements anywhere going to go the Turkish way? And I think that's the point where all of them are making. Whether it's Ghanouchi in Tunisia or all the Egyptian Brotherhood people saying we are looking at AKP as a model. And if you see the background, also the very personal level of people like Gül and Erdogan is very much in those networks. Gül and Erdogan were activists in WAMI and those organizations, Brotherhood organizations, back in the 70s. So there's personal connections and ideological connections that go back 40 years now. The AKP has taken that kind of evolution, and Brotherhood organization, particularly the second generation in Egypt, is talking about it. They went, they went to Turkey last week for Erbakan's funeral, and they're having talks, and they're openly saying they want to follow the Turkish model. Whether that is the case or not, that's difficult to say. I think the Egyptian Brotherhood in particular has not had the kind of generational shift that took place within the Turkish Islamist movement in the 1990s, when Erdogan and Gül moved away from Erbakan and decided to work within the system more, to abandon, to shed some of the aspects of Erbakan's ideology. That shift has not yet taken place within the Egyptian Brotherhood. And also Turkey is, a very different society from Egypt. About whole, difficult to make that comparison. On a side note, when it comes to the West, on Turkey, I think it's interesting to see how the Turkish government is very much playing a role of supporter of these brotherhood networks in the West. Whether it's been supporting cases like the Mavi Marmara and the flotilla, or providing support. Pretty much every conference of these brotherhood networks is taking place in Istanbul over the last 3 or 4 years. Milli Görüş, which is the Turkish sort of outfit linked to this network, is increasingly supported by the Turkish government. So that's not so surprising development, but in a way it is concerning some European authorities, because they always taken Turkish Islam as kind of a counterbalance, Turkish state Islam as sort of a counterbalance to Turkish Islamist Islam. And now the two are kind of the same. So that is, especially in Germany and Austria, that is quite concerning.
Last question then. Final word.
Yeah.
Microphone's coming.
İdil İzmirli, George Mason University Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. My focus is actually Hizb ut-Tahrir al-Islami. And would you say that I studied the group also based on face-to-face interviews and for many years now, especially in Ukraine and also in the former Soviet Union. But I know that they are very powerful group in UK and Europe as well. And they do not look at the Turkish model as Muslim Brotherhood as a good model, because they think it's the greatest evil of the world because of the termination of the Caliphate during Atatürk's time. So would you say that Hizb ut-Tahrir al-Islami is one of the biggest competing groups to Muslim Brotherhood in Europe?
No, I would put Hizb ut-Tahrir in a completely different category. I mean, Hizb ut-Tahrir is marginal, number-wise. I mean, they're very vocal, but it's marginal. I mean, it's kind of the Trotskyite of political Islam. I mean, even in a country like the UK, it's probably a couple of thousand people, and we're talking about two completely different levels. The Muslim Brotherhood wants to be the representatives of the Muslim community. They want to participate in the political discourse at all levels. Hizb ut-Tahrir takes, I call him the participationist. Hizb ut-Tahrir takes its rejectionist approach, where participating in democracy is sinful and so forth. They cater to, young disenfranchised, whether, it's in universities or, but very, very different level, small, and different agenda, completely different agenda. So I would put them in very different categories.
I realize that, but I meant in terms of the membership, because in Ukraine, for instance, in 3-4 years, the membership, I mean, of course, we don't know the membership yet, but it went from 600 to 30,000 in Crimea only. Mm-hmm. So this is why I was wondering in terms of the membership.
Hizb ut-Tahrir is it's a very secretive organization, so it's not easy to know how many members they had. I think most European intelligence agencies would argue that, depending on the country, we're talking about a few hundred. The Germans talk about a few, even if it's banned, but there are a few hundred. The UK, where probably that's the largest following, it's
UK and Jordan.
couple of thousand, but it's small. It does not have the kind of influence. I mean, when we talk about the Brotherhood, we're talking about controls of mosques. We're talking about large mainstream organizations. Yes, small numbers, but large control of these organizations and very visible and vocal. Hizb ut-Tahrir, it's really the Trotskyite of the Islamist movement. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Excellent presentation.